So I'm very happy today to introduce Darren McKnight. He's a technical director at Suntory, and today he's going to make a talk about space safety as a foundation for reliable space traffic management. So I've met Darren, I think, over 10 years ago at ISC conference and also already exchanging on space debris. So he's really one, I would say, expert on the topic, but also on space traffic management. He's also a member of the IAA Space Debris Committee, also member of several ISC committee. I see also on at the ECAS committee. So he's also very present internationally. Um, he also co-authored a book with Nick Johnson, which was the former NASA chief scientist of orbital debris at NASA in the 90s. So we can see that his expertise comes from way back. And now he's, I would say, focusing on monitoring and characterization of the conjunction dynamic for massive direct objects. I'm very glad to have him today. He's, for me, a very inspiring expert, and he's really one of the person that makes like complicated topics very simple. And I hope that you will all learn a lot from Darren today. So, Darren, I give you the floor.
Super. Thank you, Emmanuel, very much. And I appreciate everybody taking their time away from lunch to listen to me. I'll try and make sure that it's worth your time. I'm just going to get right into the business here. I think the most important thing to think about when you talk about space debris is people seem to like to have these standard lines that they use in space news that just make sense, but they really don't. And so what I want to do is I'm probably going to explain a couple things to you today that you probably thought made real good sense, but they're really not such good ideas. So be looking for some things that maybe will question some of your standard understanding of space debris during this talk. The most important thing to begin with here is a lot of people are talking about space traffic management, and the space traffic management, is talked about fueling this $1 trillion space economy, all these new constellations, all these new countries getting involved. What I'm really worried about is that you want to try and build this space economy, but if you don't really manage the debris collision risk by better debris mitigation and better debris remediation, then the space traffic management, all these constellations are not going to survive. So that's kind of the story I have today I want to talk to you about. I think the thing that's really important is to think about the word responsibility as a guiding principle. Many people think that space is all about commerce. We need to move forward, we need to get work done, and we need to make money. But in reality, if we're not careful how we do that, we're not going to be able to be making money for very long. So space traffic management is important. I don't want to downplay the importance of the need for efficient, effective collision avoidance. There's some great opportunities for improving on mathematical algorithms to be more accurate in our assessments of how close satellites are getting. It's important to share the data. It's important to be collaborative and having companies and countries work together. As you all may have heard a few months back when a SpaceX satellite, SpaceX didn't answer the phone when they were getting close to a European satellite, and the Europeans went ahead and moved because SpaceX didn't return the phone call. Those kinds of things should not be allowed to persist. So today I'm going to talk to you about 3 simple actions that I believe should be taken that will allow us to be assured of reliable space operations in the future for some of these new constellations. So don't build space traffic management on weak foundations. So 3 things. First, we need to stop launching rocks. And what I mean by that is that there's no need right now for us to continue to launch satellites that do not have collision avoidance or CA capability. It's silly, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Number 2, we need to stop littering. And it's not just that we can't use space, but right now the standard is 25 years after an object finishes its operational capabilities, it needs to be removed from space. That's the metric. That's a horrible metric, by the way. So many of you think, well, 25 years means we're being safe. It's not, you're not safe at all, and I'll explain why that's the case. And then lastly, we need to pick up some of our debris. So you might have heard the word debris mitigation. That means don't make more. Debris remediation means pick up the trash you've already left. And so we will talk a little bit about what are the objects that need to be removed. So those three things, by the end of the talk, hopefully you'll feel good about. And why do we need to stop making more debris? Well, there's two ways in which debris really affects space operations. The first way, the big objects that we can see in the catalog, they add a lot of collision avoidance burden. So what that means is an operational satellite who's responsible enough to have collision avoidance capability, that means they've got to spend a lot of time avoiding this big stuff, the things that are trackable. However, in reality, almost 100%, 97, 98% of the mission terminating risk comes from objects that aren't in the catalog. So again, this is one of these counterintuitive facts I want you all to walk away with. If you think when they avoid a collision with a trackable object, they've avoided the hazard of space debris, you've only avoided 2 or 3% of the hazard. Most of it comes from these objects about 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters in low Earth orbit that you can't see that can kill you. And so that's why it's important to not let debris grow. So let's look at the 25-year rule first. 25-year rule was established in the mid-1990s. And people have said, this is good, it's great, this is what we should be doing. And one of the reasons that they use to support this hypothesis is this plot that you see to the right here. And what this plot shows you is looking at over 200 years time, that if you used a 25-year rule versus say a 5-year rule, you only get about a 10% difference in the growth of debris over 200 years. So they're saying, yeah, it's not really worth our time. The problem is this is really not, I don't believe, a logical analysis. So this 200-year aggregates all cataloged objects, the ones that are big enough for us to see, across all of low Earth orbit. And so that means that everything up to 2,000 kilometers is all considered. So that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Well, if you peel the onion back, it kind of doesn't. It really ignores breakup events about 800 kilometers and below, because you could have something, two objects collided 800 kilometers, make thousands of pieces of debris and wash out within a couple decades of time and never show up on this plot to the right. And so what it really does is it sort of ignores the altitude from 800 kilometers and below. And there's a lot of satellites going up there. And I'll show you in a moment why there are a lot of satellites going up there. And so these events could actually make the use of constellations, any satellites below 800 kilometers, untenable, very expensive, and not really viable. Yet still, you would have over a 200-year time frame. This change would be a marginal change in the growth over 200 years for all of low Earth orbit for the catalog debris. So in summary, this 200-year metric of looking at the 25-year rule, it may help environmental stability, the total number of objects, but it's really bad for business. It's bad for space safety below 800 kilometers. So let's take another look at this unintended consequence of the 25-year rule. I apologize about this ugly sort of plot to the right here. I'll try to describe it to begin with. First off, compliant versus non-compliant. If you look at an intact object and the 25-year rule is going to naturally be followed, you need to leave your object about 650 kilometers or lower altitude. So basically, if you are below 650 kilometers, you're compliant without doing any propulsive maneuvers at all, because once your satellite dies over 25 years, it'll just come down on its own. So as a result, you see this green curve, which is the new spatial density of all the operational satellites. And I'm sure all of you know what this spike is right here. It's SpaceX. And this curve was done a while back, so this will be even more pronounced now with some of the later deployment. So the green curve shows all the operational satellites. You see several different peaks of a lot of operational satellites, because if you launch below 650, you don't have to put any collision avoidance capability on your satellite, which seems kind of silly. Well, the other bad news is that if I was operating to the right of this compliant line, say 700, 800, 900 kilometers. When I'm done with my satellite, my job is just to dump it below 650 kilometers. Well, you all can figure out exactly what's going on here. They're also compliant by putting their garbage right where we're letting these new satellite constellations be deployed because it's more efficient. They're naturally compliant. Well, this is why I say, you know, to be compliant doesn't mean you're being safe. So back to this curve, the red curve is actually the clusters of dead objects. As Emmanuel mentioned earlier, I really go and look for objects that are massive and dead because they're the ones that are most likely to generate debris in the future, even though nobody is tracking their collisions, their close approaches, because they're both dead. They only track their close approaches if there's a live object involved. So it's very interesting to me as you start to say, well, 25 years isn't very long, but in reality, 25 years is a long time. Back in the 90s, when we weren't so densely populated in Earth orbit, 25 years seemed like a reasonable constraint. Should have been updated, in my opinion, because now 25 years is 5 generations of spacecraft, right? They're doing 135,000 orbits in that time of letting objects just continue to go for 25 years before you pull it out, sweeping out a lot of volume and it's encountering a lot of active satellites. So 25-year rule doesn't make any sense. Well, let's take a look at maybe other options. In other words, maybe instead of the 25-year rule, why not a 5-year rule or a 1-year rule? Which would in essence would be saying, hey, if you leave debris up there, it should come out after 5 years or come out after 1 year. So what would that look like? Well, this curve is developed by Christophe Bonal and Luciano Anselmo, kind of showing the progression of the spatial density of the cataloged objects over the last few decades. And so you see where the 25-year rule is. And I want to mention other thing. A lot of people say, well, the PMD reliability, how well post-mission disposal reacting to the 25-year rule, how reliable you are is more important than the actual threshold. But in reality, if you look at it, that's really just a function of atmospheric drag. And so where you put the rule, whether it be a 25-year rule, which is about 650 kilometers, or whether or not you pick a 5-year rule, which is around 500 kilometers, or a 1-year rule, which would be 400 kilometers. So I will tell you now, I believe that in addition to all satellites need to have collision avoidance capability if above 400 kilometers, that I think everybody's job should be to have a 1-year rule. Once you're done with your mission life, you should move it to some place where it only stays in orbit for 1 year. So why is that important? Well, a couple of things. One, get it out of space. Number two is what's around 400 kilometers? Space station. We really don't know why we want to put a whole bunch of astronauts, men and women in space, and then say, hey, it's okay to leave debris right above it and let us work its way down and hope for the best. It seems to me to be not a very logical sequence for space safety or sustainability. So what we can do, and I won't go through these numbers, what we could do though is we can kind of see, well, what would it take? What would be the delta V, the impulse that a propulsion system would have to provide to a satellite to be able to move it from, say, 1,000 kilometers, 1,500 kilometers, 800 kilometers to either a 1-year rule or a 5-year rule. So this is basically what is the engineering constraint we're putting on spacecraft to be able to adhere to the new 5-year rule or 1-year rule that I am proposing. But remember, the 25-year rule has been around since 1990s. Everybody say, oh, it's really hard. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at the original documentation that supported the 25-year rules back in 1997, what they actually said was we can't ask satellites to adhere to a more stringent PMD, post-mission disposal threshold, than 25 years, because that takes about 2 to 5% of the dry mass of an upper stage to be able to adhere to the 25-year rule. So listen carefully. They're saying we can't put such a burden on the spacecraft designers. So all of you who are listening to me right now know that spacecraft capabilities have increased astronomically as far as their ability to power, pointing, propulsion, and processing to enable payloads. Those are my 5 Ps for the ones of you who think I used to be a professor. Those are my teaching points there. When you look at the capabilities of satellites, they've improved so much. So the question is adhering to a 25-year rule or a 5-year rule or 1-year rule, is it easy or hard? So I talked to some real rocket scientists. And this is a chart that I came up with a couple of my colleagues from Aerojet Rocketdyne, like I said, real rocket scientists. And what this plot shows, a little bit busy, looked at 3 different satellite classes, 15 kilogram, 300 kilogram, and 2,000 kilogram spacecraft. So small, medium, large. Looked at 3 different kinds of propulsion systems, monopropellant system, bipropellants, and electric thrusters, and said, what would be the percentage of fuel to the mass of the spacecraft I would be required to have on my satellites to be able to adhere to the 1-year rule, to move my spacecraft to 400 kilometers when I was done. And what's interesting is, if you take a look, and again, I know this is very busy, but I drew lines for you for the 2 to 5%. So what this says is, for a spacecraft at 600 kilometers, very easy to meet with bipropellant, the 2 to 5% of the mass margin that I talked about earlier, that said we had to be able to meet. Well, the electric thrusters are down here at 1%. Well, from 800 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers, or even up to 1,500 kilometers, what you can see is, obviously the bipropellant and monopropellants don't do as good of a job. So you have a much greater burden from an engineering perspective, which is what the people who developed the 25-year rule had in mind, because those are the propulsion systems that were available. But now electric thrusters are available. Now we can actually move all these spacecraft from way up in low Earth orbit to a 1-year rule and meet the 2 to 5%. So this is really what I would say is that the space safety thresholds have not kept up with space technology. So there should have been a reevaluation maybe every 5 years of this 25-year rule, which wasn't done. And as a result, now you can see it's very easy to meet the 2 to 5% mass margin that they said was sort of the threshold of why we couldn't make it more stringent. So in summary, what I want to talk about is, a lot of people think about space traffic management as the end-all be-all. It's the thing that we have to do and we have to do well. But in reality, I don't think it is. It's really just an enabler for space safety. It's an enabler for space safety. And remember what I talked about at the very beginning. We need the debris hazard comes from both the lethal non-trackable, what you cannot see can kill you, and that's 95, 97% of the mission terminating risk. And then of course the collision avoidance burden, which will become significant when you start to have these constellations that have 10, 20, 30, 50. And by the way, you heard me just say constellations. I love it when I have an opportunity to teach that none of you should ever utter the word mega constellation, okay? Please promise me one thing, never say that. Why? Because there are no mega constellations. Mega is 10 to the 6. If you want to sound like a journalist, call it a mega constellation. If you want to sound like a scientist or a policymaker, say constellation, and then we can define them. There are some constellations with 10 satellites that pose greater risk than constellations with 300 satellites. So we need to be careful about that, I believe. So again, just take another opportunity for a teaching moment. So back to the basics. I mentioned the 3 things that I want us to do is all satellites above that get deployed above 400 kilometers have collision avoidance capability. It's not that hard. It's not that hard. We saw that from the Aerojet Rocketdyne study. And as I just mentioned, going to the 5-year rule, now if you do have collision avoidance capability and it's electric thrusters, you can do that within, you can get down to 1-year rule. And that Aerojet Rocketdyne paper that we just finished, it just got accepted for the European Conference on Space Debris in April. So if you're going to be joining that, you can hear the real rocket scientists talk about the specifics on that study. The next thing, pick up your trash. So as Emmanuel had said, I do spend a lot of time looking at the stuff that other people don't look at. Everybody's worried about all the conjunction assessments between operational satellites. I care about the dead stuff. Do you realize that there are 9,000 kilogram rocket bodies that have been deposit in low Earth orbit that if they were to collide, they would double the catalog population in one event. And of these 20 of these SL-16 rocket bodies are 9,000 kilograms each, 18 of them are within 40 kilometers altitude of each other. So we've had misses between them on the order of 45, 47 meters. And if they were to have collided, they would have doubled the catalog population in one event. But nobody's tracking those. We got to keep track of those. So what I did is I got a number of people together. We had 19 scientists from 13 countries and organizations. And we said, what are the top 50 objects that need to come out of orbit? What are the ones that folks like Jean-Paul's working with ClearSpace? What should ClearSpace go grab? Well, here, ClearSpace, here, Astroscale, here, Airbus, here are the objects that need to go. And we just completed that paper, like I said, with 13 different countries represented. And basically, guess what? Not a big surprise to me. The top 18 were basically those SL-16 rocket bodies. That paper just got accepted for Active Astronautica, so you can get that on the internet soon, or let me know if you'd like to get a copy of it. So that's all the prepared charts I have for you. I can say this morning, calling from America, but I believe that we can open things up for question and answer.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. As Candice mentioned, you can write your question in the chat for the Q&A, and I will read them to Darren. Before, I see that I let you write a few questions. I wanted also to take the opportunity to make a little advertisement to our event that eSpace gonna hold in the 16th to the 18th of February on sustainable space logistics. If you want also to learn more about the thematics and have also other inputs, I put here the program so you can have a look and and sign up. So I see the first question from Romain Books. He's like asking, to which extent the space fence and the new tracking capabilities will or can reduce the population of lethal non-trackable objects and thus the risk of lethal collisions with untrackable objects?
That's a great question. So actually, Emmanuel noted I just had an op-ed in Space Global Watch about this exact topic. So the Sband Fence that was just opened up will provide an opportunity to be able to reliably characterize objects down to around 2 centimeters in low Earth orbit. The problem is, if you have one S-band fence, that gives you a good idea of where they are, but you don't get a chance to update the state vectors very often with only one S-band fence. It's a great start. It's a good way to get a sampling and get kind of like how many objects are there. But to be able to put it into a catalog to do collision avoidance, you really need to get more measurements. And so at the same time, I don't know if you're all familiar with a company called Leo Labs. Leo Labs also has an S-band fence, and they're opening a second one in Costa Rica. They have one that's in New Zealand and one in Costa Rica opening up in February. So they'll have 2 S-band fences. So what'll happen is then you can significantly reduce the amount of time that you have to propagate the orbits to do the state vector estimation. And so what's great about that is you really get an exponential return on the accuracy. And for these smaller objects, they're much more affected by drag because they have characteristically a higher area to mass ratio and more dynamic in nature because they may be fragments that came from a collision, explosions, or they're tumbling. So they're harder to keep the covariance small for the smaller objects. So you really need to get more S-band fences. So Leo Labs actually is planning on putting out 6 S-band fences in the next year or so. That will allow you to actually do collision avoidance for these lethal non-trackable. The single S-band fence just shows you there's a problem. It's kind of like, hey, I know there's a virus out there somewhere. So I'm going to tell you what it is, but I can't tell you exactly where it is. But once you get several of these S-band fences, you'll be able to build a catalog of them, and then you'll be able to actually avoid them.
thank you very much, yeah, for this answer. Next question is from Natalia Archina, and she's asking, how critical do you think internal cooperation is with respect to standard setting and information exchange?
So I don't know if all y'all get graded on your questions, but so far those are A+ questions. So if professors are listening to folks, those are A+ questions. So international cooperation is really important. For example, the United States government just went through updating the orbital debris mitigation standard practices. And one of the concerns that people had within the United States was we can't change from 25-year rule to a 5-year rule because that will disadvantage US satellite operators. And what I've tried to get across to them is if you look back in 1990s, when we first came out with the debris mitigation guidelines, the US indeed said, we're going to do this first. But then people like the French made it a law. So let's give the French credit. They actually just said, not just a guideline, a law. Very quickly, the international community got together and said, hey, that makes good sense. So I think right now, some of these guidelines are being delayed, being put in place because they're afraid about being the first one to do it. So without that cooperation to say, we're going to do this all, we're all going to move to a 25-year rule to a 5-year rule together. And for some reason, that just isn't quite happening. And so that's why it's vitally important we have that. And oftentimes the way to do that is you do like I tried to do with this last paper. We need to get rid of some objects. Which objects need to go first? Everybody's waving their hands. I said, well, why don't we write a paper with 13 different countries? We have China, Russia, Italy, UK, Germany, France, Japan. We got together and we agreed. So if we can do the scientists, hopefully that'll be the next step for the policymakers to actually decide.
That's a good point. Thank you. And I will then follow up with the question of Jean-Paul Kneip about how to enforce the 1-year rule. So I hear it's through maybe, yeah, I'll let you answer on this question.
So enforce is hard, right? Because so far these guidelines, it's kind of like what standard practice is, but there aren't any incentives, any disincentives if you don't follow the rule, right? So that's one of the real problems right now. And I tell you, I'm not sure exactly, people have said before naming and shaming was a good way of doing it, right? So if you don't follow it, people should internationally be told they didn't follow it. People aren't going to care about that. So I believe that there probably has to be some sort of fiscal way to do that, right? That if there's some sort of fund that you put in and you put some money into a fund, kind of like an escrow. I don't know if that term translates well, but you put it in an escrow. And if you do what you're supposed to do, you get the money back. And if you don't do what you're supposed to do, then it stays within this account that maybe can be used by people like Astroscale and ClearSpace to go clean up some of these derelict objects. I think that's the only way it's going to happen. You put it in advance and you get the money back. You get the refund back, right? So it's like you rent a bike to go around Amsterdam and you have to put down $20 deposit to make sure you bring the bike back, right? I think that something that simple might make sense.
Yeah, and then we'll ask the second question of Jean-Paul is like, do we need multiple 5G constellations or could we just have one?
Oh, that's a really great question. And I'm the wrong, I do know some things well, I don't know that very well, but my opinion is, and this is not a really educated opinion since I'm not a 5G person, but I think that we're overdoing, I think that we're all kind of going after a very small market with a lot of constellations. So I always keep telling people, all these constellations are not going to be deployed. They can't be, there's not enough market. And a lot of the people who can do this terrestrially are waiting to see when the constellation gets really, really good, they might just drop the prices a little bit and throw off this entire dynamic. So I think that's a really good question. And no, I don't think we need that much. And I do think that, if you're investing money, don't put it in a satellite constellations right now, I don't think. If you're just a single investor, because some of these are going to fail. Some of these are going to fail. Obviously, SpaceX is going on the road. And what we've learned, by the way, which ones always succeed? The ones that get into space and get started. OneWeb is a great example, right? It's a wonderfully engineered satellite that was done by OneWeb and Airbus, and it's just really but they had things on orbit. So of course they're going to be more likely to survive, and they have. And I think that's a good thing. But I think after you get past the SpaceX and OneWebs, I think there's going to be a lot of fallout of failures. Because the market just isn't there for all of them to be deployed.
That's a good point. Thank you. So next question, I try to pronounce the last name correctly, from Thomas Ozensky. So he's asking, STM discussions today often showcase opinions calling for more international standardization. Beyond the existing space standard through ISO or some newer industry platform, what other STM-related standards in terms of data, design, or others are still missing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Thomas. So I believe, and I'm right now helping Christophe Banal co-chair IAF, Space Traffic Management Working Group. We have 8 different teams that they're looking at 8 different aspects of this, and I think that I think one of the problems that we have about the standardization process is that we think we have a format is going to solve all the problems. It's very important. The format is very, very good. The formatting, say, conjunction data warnings. But I believe that everybody's how we actually send that information along, right? So I think I think some of the standardization has to do with the actual transfer of the data, and also to understand that there's not a standard risk that somebody's going to say, I can accept this risk and another constellation can have another risk. So I think, Thomas, part of my answer is going to be, I don't think we can standardize everything, right? If one satellite constellation says, I'm gonna allow conjunctions to occur that have a risk of greater than 10 to minus 4, another one might say, I'm not going to let things happen that are going to be less than a risk of 10 to minus 3. I think those things are going to have to continue to go, and I think that there's a lot of issues about what altitudes have significantly different kinds of criteria. So I actually think, Thomas, that what's going to be the hardest thing is how do we figure out some flexible standards? They change by altitude because you do have longer time that debris will remain on orbit, longer time your gyros remain on orbit for what altitude you're at. So I know that's going to be very hard to implement, but I think that there's going to have to be some sensitivity to what altitude you're applying these standards to. So I don't know if I answered your question completely, Thomas, but I think that the risk issue is something that is going to be hard to get our hands around.
So I take the opportunity to ask also one of my question I have myself. I was wondering, I heard lately in the community that there was also sometimes some skepticism around the different space debris population propagation tools, the European one versus the US one, and that's maybe that they have been used in the last, like, I think 10, 20 years, but maybe they are showing their limit. So I wanted to have your opinion on this, I would say, debate that is arising in the community.
So Manuel, do you mean master and ordum, or do you mean legend looking at the long-term growth? Which debate do you mean?
There are the two debates.
Yeah, there's at least 2.
Okay, yeah, because when I saw the graph with legend, I thought first, yeah, with legend maybe, and
Good. I'm glad, because the ordum master is an easy answer, so we don't want to do that one. But I'll tell you that later. Fair, in my opinion. On the long term, I think the biggest issue is to understand that if you show something for 200 years and show it, we need to have error bars on those, because I will tell you right now that the error bars on any of those 200-year propagation are larger than any of the differences between the 1 year, 5 year, 25 year, and no PMD rule at all. The uncertainty is greater than all of those. So the classic forecasting rule is you look back twice as far as you're looking forward. Well, we only have 60 years in space age. How in the world can you actually do anything that has any reasonableness looking at 200 years? I actually think it's it's wasted effort, and it actually does more harm than good. I think we should be focusing on 5, 10, 20 years and having high confidence. And the 200 years, I think, is fairly useless. It's fun academically, but I don't think from an operational sense it's relevant. And I think it can actually teach you bad habits, which I think that the 200-year rule saying, here's why we can't, 200-year propagation, here's why we can't change to a 5-year rule because 25-year and 5-year are 10% off. Shoot, there's 100% error on the answers. So I don't think there's really any difference. So I think the biggest problem, people put too much emphasis, they want to use it for operational decisions. That's really only about sort of scientific, here's what happens if all goes wrong, but launch rates, types of satellite construction, solar activity, all of those have much greater uncertainty than the 10% difference they were trying to use to differentiate, in my opinion, right? So that's a great question. I think all of them that go out more than 10 to 20 years actually can actually provide us some bad advice. So I think all of those need to be kept to much shorter time frames.
Cool. Thank you for your answer. We have another question from Jean-Paul Kneib, asking if can optical band ground-based imaging of debris be complementary or better than Neolab's radio satellites tracking?
Absolutely, yeah. So whatever it comes down to, I believe is you need to be able to get multiple pieces of data, fuse data from multiple sources to build a catalog that talks about here is what the population looks like. And there's some really good light curve work that's been done by the Belgians and the Russians about these derelict objects in low Earth orbit. That's very important information. But what's really important about the LEO labs, or for any Sband Fence, is the traceability to real-time conjunction assessment. So I try to separate out that I think there's a lot of fusion of information to build a more robust satellite catalog. I think the current satellite catalog is provided by spacetrack.org. In about 2 years, you'll go, wow, we used to call that a catalog? That's not a catalog. What we need to do is what Jean-Paul just suggested is, if there's an object in the catalog, we should be trying to characterize it with radar, optical, any way we can to be able to say object, 22566 in the satellite catalog is not just a number. It's not just rocket body. It should be, 4 meters long, 2 meters in diameter, tumbling at this rate, all the things that can be done to be fused together. That provides nice input for the rapid conjunction assessments. It have to be done with really, really real time, because then what that will do is it'll say, instead of these two objects getting close to each other and going, oh, I don't know. Well, it's different if these are two 11-meter long rocket bodies and they miss by 30 meters, and if there are two pieces of debris, right? So that richness, I think, that would combine radar, optical, and other kinds of analyses should go at the catalog level. But when you're looking at the conjunction level, we need to be rapid turnaround, traceability from measurement, propagation to conjunction. But that can be flavored and enriched by a better catalog to say what those two objects are and what they are doing.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you for the answer. Next question. I'm happy we have a lot of questions in the audience. So thank you, everyone. And don't hesitate to write some more questions, because we do have times. And I think this is a really interesting discussion. So Lawrence is asking, so firstly, thank you for your presentation. How soon should similar questions be answered for traffic around the moon or other bodies with the added constraint of planetary protection? Yeah, very cool question. I'm happy to, thrilled to hear the answer.
Yes, well, and again, you always ask, you saying for me to give an answer. I'm giving you my opinion, obviously. I'm sure many people on here could answer some of these questions much better than I could, but I get the opportunity to give my opinion. I think that we typically always wait for a disaster before we want to respond. And so I really think now is the time to start looking at what those risks are in lunar orbit, so we don't wait until there's an issue that comes up, right? So I think it's already time, and I've actually reviewed a paper. I don't remember the name of the author, but I reviewed a paper where he had already done some analysis about looking at the debris population in the future around the moon. So I think now's the time. You know, let's not wait until, I often have a line that nobody gets an award for preventing a disaster that didn't occur. So we always have to wait for a disaster before we respond heroically. I would like to be the one to solve the problem before there's a disaster. And so I think the lunar debris mapping and risk around there should be addressed immediately.
Yeah, very very good point. And we see also already in the community around, in the lunar community also, there are groups around system to point out. So Benjamin Gezas is asking, could satellites themselves be used to track space debris?
So what was the question again?
Could satellite themselves be used to track space debris?
Sure, there are some space-based, space-based space surveillance systems that are looking at doing it. Absolutely, yeah. And there's some benefit to that. Obviously, you get a lot shorter distance, so you should be able to get some better measurements as far as where you are relative to that. So that's a pro, right? You'd be able to get some really good state vector estimation about where they are. Then the problem is, you have something that's in orbit. That's a risk. And its viewability of other objects is not quite as good as from the ground. We can put up a fence and have things come over you. So I think, again, it can be a valuable part of the contribution, but from the point of view of cost and risk, I think people are just balancing those things out. But there are space-based, space surveillance satellites that have been put in orbit to do that sort of thing. But it seems like economically we can get the throughput up and not pose a risk by that space-based system by keeping it on the ground. But it doesn't mean it's not a good idea. It just means that I think that the business model has lended itself more for the ground-based. We should use all the data that we can to do these catalogs.
Yeah, and also linked to this question, Frédéric Courbin is also asking if we could use the square kilometer array to track debris. If you know it, the SCA.
I do not, but what I do know is there's a wide variety of optical and radar systems out there that can, again, provide a richness to the to this, what I call this new catalog, right? So the new catalog, I think, needs to have all that stuff. We need to have knowledge accumulation by sharing that information and looking at characteristics that are relevant, and then improve the actual conjunction assessments is a real-time issue, right? So I think you want to separate the two. We want to separate the two. I think that's important from us. So that's what I've really taken away from space traffic management in the last 6 months is kind of get this feel of everything shouldn't be about a data repository, but everything to a data repository and get the information out. Well, that's great when you're trying to get a satellite catalog, but it's not great when you're trying to figure out if in one orbit you're going to miss by 25 meters or 35 meters and you have a large appendage on your side. That's got to be done real time. And putting things into data repositories, we may not have the time to be able to do that. So I think I see a striation of two different types of ways in which we use data in space traffic management, and that's a good thing, right? I think it's an evolution of how we're dealing with the problem.
Yeah, to know when you say with the cars, to know, okay, how many cars we have today that can drive, but then you want to know real time where they are and to avoid that there would be an accident.
Perfect. So, yes, good analogy.
That's good, and I think, conclusion is like whatever tools to track debris are good in order to enhance and to illustrate the catalog and to understand where are the objects. We have another question from Natalia Archina. She's asking, do you think collision avoidance can be realized effectively by ad hoc bilateral cooperation? And would, in the end, a coordinating international entity be necessary? That's an exciting question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I will answer the first question first. I really, the last question first. I really don't think that we need an organizing body to say move or don't move. I do think we need to have a standards that we have practices that if you have two objects that are coming on some conjunction, and that if there's an object that's Ryan Shepard, by the way, from Iridium, wrote a great paper on this last year about best practices. Like if you have two objects and one's lower, one's higher, and there's a certain distance, who should move and which way should they move? That I believe should absolutely be standardized. But I don't believe it needs to go to a third party to say, now go do that. That it should be like an ISO standard, and people know that if I'm, for example, if I'm a telesat, future telesat satellite moving to 1,000 kilometers and is going through the SpaceX constellation, they should have a greater responsibility to make a maneuver if there's a close approach between SpaceX and them, because they're going through their operational altitude, right? Mm-hmm. So things like that, where they agree that if you're transiting from a deployment to your actual operating altitude, you have to do the avoiding. If you're actually in your constellation, you shouldn't have to be doing the avoiding because you kind of have priority. Kind of like if you're going up a mountain or down a mountain, who has to move, right? Same kind of thing. So I think that needs to be standardized. I don't personally think there'll be a benefit for the time of making the decision to say, now let's let the international traffic coordinator say, SpaceX, you don't move, Telesat, you do move. I think that's, I don't think that's good, but I think the standards by how everybody works together absolutely needs to be an international standard and an international body like ISO saying, these are the best practices that you all should employ. That's my feeling.
Thank you for your answer. Yeah, we have a question from Benjamin Gezas asking, so with electric propulsion, do you mean plasma ion propulsion as Vasimir, for example?
Sure, there's a wide variety of electric thruster technologies that all basically give you the same benefits. Some of them are a little bit operationally more cumbersome because you need a little bit more warm-up time for the chamber for the fuel. So they're not identical, but from a point of an ISP specific impulse, they're at a certain level. Some of them operationally have a little bit more delay and be able to actually do that maneuver itself. So we mean that in a very general sense. If you look at our paper, it has a lot more of the details. And again, I'm willing to share that paper, even though it's not going to be published for real until the the European Conference on Space Debris in April, but I'm willing to pass it along early. And we have all those details in there from the Aerojet rocket dying guys, the real rocket scientists. So
yeah, that's I'm trying to look for the link to the conference, the Space Debris Conference, so people can also register.
Yes, yeah, they should do
I
that.
would put it in the chat. Oh no, I put it to everyone, and that's here. So I do have a question. I see there's none, so I can ask my question about sometime also you showed this graph where basically the, like I would say, constellation like Starlink, they are compliant to the space debris regulation, but on the other hand, everyone is also telling them that so it's very bad for the space debris, like for the, I would say, for the low Earth orbit, because it's increasing so much the population there. But on the other side, they are not at the 800 kilometer orbit, which is really the most crowded orbit. So sometimes I'm a bit confused to know, like, are they really such bad guys everyone is telling them, or they are still a bit good guys because they are trying their best, because at the end it's not for their interest also to let's say screw up low Earth orbit. So I wanted to have your expert opinion on this debate also.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I exactly understand your question, Manuel. I'll start answering. Tell me if I'm going the wrong direction. But to me, there really aren't any good guys and bad guys on this, because if you look at the major objects that have been deposited in low Earth orbit that are posing a great risk, 80% of them are of Russian Soviet origin, but they were following the rules that were available at the time. So it's not really to say poking them in the eye going, you didn't do your job. That was just the way they did things. It didn't break any guidelines or rules at the time. So I think really what I'm looking at more is just trying to figure out that we don't have any unintended consequences of what we think are safety guidelines that are actually making things less safe. So what's happened has happened, right? The stuff is there. Now let's start to deal with it and don't add to it, right? So which is why actually, Emmanuel, this really brings us back to my talk for today is stop launching satellites that can't do collision avoidance maneuvers. Stop acting like if you can remove an object 25 years after it's been on orbit, then you're being safe. You're not being safe. You're using an archaic threshold that no longer is relevant for the current population, right? So I think that those things go together to sort of saying we have some massive objects that have great debris generating potential we need to get rid of. Let's not add any more. Let's not make this problem any worse than it already is by taking the easy road. Oh, we need to let people fly CubeSats without electric thruster, without any kind of propulsion system because we don't want to discourage innovation. No, you're right. We don't want. So the CubeSats that have no propulsion, launch them from the space station, right? We get a lot of really good, fun work done. But I think building constellations like Spire that are 3U CubeSats with no collision avoidance capability, we shouldn't continue to encourage that, right? We shouldn't continue to encourage hundreds of 15 kilogram satellites at 600 kilometers with no ability to avoid collisions with other objects. We need to all be responsible. So I think that's where we are. I think that what has happened has happened. Companies like Astroscale, ClearSpace, Airbus are gonna eventually get catalyzed to be able to help in moving some of those massive objects, right? Unfortunately, what's probably gonna happen instead, two SL8s or two SL16s will collide. There'll be a huge mess. There'll be 60 minutes. They'll be interviewing me going, Dr. McKnight, you told them not to do this. Why'd they not do anything about it? Well, because it was expensive to do in advance. And nobody gets an award for preventing a disaster that never occurred, right? So I just want us to try not to have our children say, you mean, Dad, people continue to launch satellites to 800 kilometers that didn't have any collision avoidance capability and they thought that was okay? Well, why would you ever launch a satellite that couldn't avoid a collision? Is that responsible? That's where I think we need to put our effort on identifying good and bad guys. And we're the good or bad guys, depending on if we do it, if we're responsible and proactive. Sorry, you struck a note with me there that I'm glad you asked.
Okay, so yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, bottom line, don't send anything without collision avoidance capability.
Be responsible before, during, and after your mission, right?
Yeah, that's good. And I think now we can have one last question, and then we'll have to close the section. Yeah, Romain Books is asking, what do you think of bond mechanism, meaning what is proposed by the FCC to incentivize deorbiting instead of command and control rules?
I think that we have to do that, right? I think that the FCC has tried to do it. They've kind of gotten slapped down, going, no, that's too hard. You're making it too hard on people. I think we have to make it hard on ourselves, right? It's, I absolutely think that should happen. And it's just surprising to me that anybody would think that we're being too hard and constricting space commerce, because you will not see a constriction of space commerce like you're going to see if we have some of these massive collision events in low Earth orbit. Right now, you're going to see space commerce being restricted. So I'd rather do it on our own terms than have it be imposed on us because of some events that occurred because of our lack of responsibility.
Good. Yeah,
I played on a U.S. government official, so I have no say on if they're going to do that or not. But that's my opinion. And I've let people know my opinion very clearly, by the way, in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so now we have two last minute questions. We'll take them from so Jean-Paul Kneip. So he's saying moving active satellites orbits cost less in propulsion if done well in advance, but then collision prediction need to be constantly up to date and easily available to everyone. So are we close to such information availability, or are we missing a good catalog to start with?
Yeah, so I think the catalog has to improve, and I
Mm-mm.
think that the capabilities to provide that information in timely fashion needs to improve. And I think that it's being done. There's some really good
Mm-mm.
efforts to do that sort of thing. Exo Analytics has done a good job of that, and Leo Comstock, right, through the
Mm-mm.
Space Data Association, have done a lot of good work. I think, as I mentioned, Leo Labs name before,
Mm-mm.
in low Earth orbit, they do a lot. That they're really improving with their radars that are being laid out globally, and there are some good. I'm trying to think. There's a couple of good efforts that are doing that, but I think I think we're getting there, but we're not there
Mm-mm.
yet. We're not there yet.
Mm-mm. And then the last one, and I'm sorry for the others. If you have other questions, you can still send them per email, and I'm sure Darren will be happy to answer it. So do current guidelines take into account only loss of investment for satellites, or also the potential of harming astronauts on the ISS? I assume guidelines which secure the health of humans would be much stricter.
Yes, that's a great question. I don't understand why it is that
Mm-mm.
NASA, who's responsible for manned space flight, the United States, for the International Space Station, and everybody who's on the International Space Station, aren't saying, "Hey, why would we want to sort of tempt fate?" The reason why that's not a big deal, by the way, by mathematically, is because at 400 kilometers, the atmospheric density is so high, stuff comes through it pretty quickly. But I don't want to keep rolling the dice, as I would say, to keep gambling that, hey, I'm going to roll the dice. It's probably not going to happen. It's probably not going to happen. We roll the dice enough, it's going to happen, right? And there have been more collision avoidance maneuvers conducted by the space station in the last year than like the last 6 years before that. So they're beginning to see more maneuvers being required. And so more of a collision avoidance burden being put on the space station. That's not an easy system to move.
Mm-mm.
Right. So I don't know why they act like there's not a big tin can full of people there, and it should be different. But I think that the atmospheric density and how quickly it comes through sort of goes, it's not a big deal. But it won't be a big deal until it is a big deal, right? And again, the
Yeah.
rate of the collision avoidance have increased significantly. So
Cool. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I think with this last answer, we can close this today's seminar. I want to warmly thank Darren for joining to present to us so early from the US side. But it's okay because you're early bird. So, but we do appreciate you taking this time, and we hope you'll be also following our event in a month on sustainable space logistics. And we're also happy to stay in touch with you. And so the slides and the recording will be available. You can send an email to Candice if you want to have the information. Yeah, so I wish you all a nice afternoon and a good beginning of the week. Thank you.
thank you for your time and your attention. I really enjoyed it. Next time, let's do it in person.
Yeah, well, let's try to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone, bye-bye.
Cheers.